Established in the 8th century, the samurais were the elite warriors of the old Japanese dynasty. With their rise in the 11th century, the samurais grew into an influential class of warriors which served their feudal lords. The samurais saw extensive actions in battles and wars ever since their introduction into the military, even fending off the Mongolian invasion. But as the second half of the 19th century begins to play out, the samurai's very existence would be challenged, as the nation would fight to preserve itself from both internal and external conflicts. For over a century, between 1467 to 1615, Japan was always in a constant state of civil war. But after all these struggles, one person would emerge victorious, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would be the first person in the Tokugawa family to become shogun, starting a new period in Japanese history, the Edo period. In hopes of preventing further conflicts within the country, the shogun would close off Japan to foreign trades and travel. With this policy in place, no one was allowed to enter nor leave Japan. The only ones that were allowed to trade with them were the Dutch in the port city of Denjima, who would supply them with matchlock guns and Western books, giving them a fraction of the knowledge that the West had. The isolationist policy would lead to the most peaceful periods in Japanese history, but while the policy did work in preventing conflicts and preserving peace inside the country, it would continuously build tensions between the classes in the social hierarchy. The policy would also essentially freeze Japan's technological development that was ongoing in the outside world. To understand how tensions were formed, we will be taking a look at the ruling system of Japan in the Edo period. On top of the social hierarchy would be the emperor, then the court nobles, the shogun, the daimyos, the samurais, the peasants, the artisans, and lastly the merchants. Each class in the hierarchy were locked, and no one was allowed to change their class nor social status. While the emperor and the court nobles are at the very top, they held very little political power, and by Japanese tradition were apolitical figures. The emperor and the court nobles would be based in Kyoto, the current capital of Japan. The shogun was equivalent to the military leader of Japan, who also has personal samurai guards at his disposal, making them the true leader of Japan. The shogun would be based in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Below the shogun are the daimyos, the title given to the rulers of small region in Japan called domains. The daimyos acted as the subordinates of the shogun, making these feudal domains under the indirect rule of the shogunate. These domains have their own groups of samurai that serve the daimyos in exchange for stipends, which are in the form of koku. Given the samurai's prestige as the defenders of the domains and the people in them, they were given special privileges of being able to wear their swords around in public, and the ability to kill anyone of the lower class that compromised their honor. Below the samurais we have the normal peasants and artisans before getting to the merchants, people who wander around selling various items for their wealth. All three of these would make the income of taxes of each domain. Tension would arise as the isolation policy would leave Japan in peace, while the samurais were defined by war. But now that there was no war to fight, their prestige began to decline, as the samurais found themselves having to retire from their duties as warriors to pursue other fields to make money. As the daimyos cut down their military, some became masterless. These samurais would take to the roads to find new lords. Meanwhile, the merchants, the people who were supposed to be at the lowest in the hierarchy, began to profit off of everyone else, even with the limited foreign trade, gradually becoming richer and surpassing the wealth of some samurais. These tensions, while small, would build up over 200 years, ready to be released, but couldn't find the right chain of events that would start the conflict. Meanwhile, the mid-19th century saw increased European activity in Asia, with Europeans colonizing India, Indonesia, and the majority of Indochina, along with humiliating China in the Opium War. It was only a matter of time before Japan also falls victim. to European imperialism. In July of 1853, Japan's 2-century-long isolation would be challenged as 4 American steam-powered warships would sail into Edo Bay. The Americans came with a very specific intention in mind: to open Japanese ports up. Commodore Matthew Perry, who was the leader of the naval squadron, would send a letter to the Shogunate, which asked for the permission of resupply of American ships that would visit Japanese ports. Although in any other situation, the request would be outright refused, the Shogunate knew that this was not a request, but a demand. Facing the possibility of conflict with the more technologically advanced country, the Shogunate government, or Bakufu, would agree to the terms, and in 1854 they would sign a treaty with the Americans. In exchange for being able to resupply in Japanese ports, Japan was gifted modern weapons and samples of Western technologies. In addition, a US consulate was to be built in Japan, which was to be used for further negotiation for future treaties. Seeing that the Americans had broken Japan's isolation, other Western powers were quick to exploit this newfound market and use their superior technologies to force Japan into signing a series of unfair treaties with the French, the British, the Dutch, and the Russians. As a result, during the next 5 years, Japan went from complete isolation to being thrown onto the world stage. But the treaties imposed on Japan would tarnish and destroy her economy and culture, adding to the instability inside the country. A second treaty with the Americans in 1858 would fully open Japan to commercial trades, which led to inflation and deficits in gold and other resources that were being exported out. And a series of treaties with the Europeans would allow foreigners to freely stay and live on Japanese soil while being immune to Japanese laws and policies. These drastic changes in the country would create further unrest among the civilians inside the country and put pressure on the shogun and the government. As the popularity of the shogunate rule was plummeting, people all around the country began to flock under the banner of the newly formed Sonojoi movement, aimed at removing the foreigners from the country and replacing the shogun with the emperor. The movement was especially strong in the domains of Satsuma, Choshu, and Mito. It is also worth noting that the emperor himself had publicly declared his dissatisfaction with the Bakufu, even outright refusing to sanction the unfair treaties that the shogunate had signed. While the tension in the country was still rising, the Bakufu had their own problems to deal with. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the current shogun, would pass away in 1858, not long after the second treaty with the Americans. As Tokugawa Ieyasu did not have a son, his death would start a succession crisis in the Tokugawa shogunate. A handful of candidates, with support from their political faction, would try out to be the next shogun. In the end, the Japanese Prime Minister, Ieyasu, was able to steer Tokugawa Iemochi as the next shogun, undermining that he was just 12 years old. Ieyasu would then presume power as the shogun from the young boy and launch a year-long crackdown all across the country against his political opponents, opposing parties, and those who were supportive of the Sonojoi movement. His crackdown, however, would lead to his own demise, as in 1860, Ieyasu would be assassinated by Ronin samurais from the Mito domain, who opposed his ruling of the country. The assassination of Ieyasu further provoked violent attacks from the supporters of the Sonojoi movement on Bakufu officials and foreigners. One of these attacks would bring Japan under pressure from the British over the death of Charles Richardson in 1862, who was a British merchant that was killed in Japan as a result of breaking Japanese law. The domain responsible for this was Satsuma, who refused to negotiate with the British for compensation, provoking them to begin assembling their navy to be sent to Satsuma. Meanwhile in Kyoto, Emperor Komei would officially endorse the Sonojoi movement. In March of 1863, the emperor would send out an order for an expulsion of all foreigners in Japan before May. A big enforcer of this order was Choshu, who began to fire on foreign ships in the Shimonoseki Strait after the expulsion deadline had arrived. Retaliation efforts from the French and American warships were not able to coerce the stubborn Choshu to halt the aggression, and with negotiations to open up the strait failing to bring results, an international fleet was to be assembled and sent to Choshu. In September of the same year, a British naval squadron arrived in Kagoshima, the capital of Satsuma. It started out as a standoff at first, but negotiations for a peaceful compensation broke down as the defenders of Kagoshima fired at the unprepared British warships. A fierce two-day-long bombardment ensued, which ended indecisively as the British were forced to withdraw due to the lack of ammunition. Surprisingly, this engagement would build friendly relations between Satsuma and Britain. Seeing the superior firepower of the West, Satsuma began to seek modern weaponry and technologies from Britain, who agreed to trade with Satsuma as they agreed to pay the compensation. With this trade agreement between Satsuma and Britain being sanctioned, Satsuma was now importing the state-of-the-art weapons from the West and distributing them among its military. Meanwhile, back in the capital of Kyoto, tensions between the supporters of the Shogunate and the supporters of the Sonojoi movement would boil over and bring the city into a chaos of political violence. Assassinations of people on both sides who opposed their movement were frequent. This became a concern to the shogun in Edo, who dispatched their army and a group of samurais to patrol the city, called the Shinsengumi, one of the most skilled and elite samurai divisions in Japan. Not long after, Choshu would attempt an attack on Kyoto. A 3,000-man army was sent out to capture the imperial palace. Choshu hopes that if they were able to secure the emperor from his pro-shogunate guards, he would further pursue the objective of the Sonojoi movement. This attack, however, would be met with overwhelming numbers of Kyoto defenders, of 50,000 soldiers from the Tokugawa government, the Shinsengumi, and the domains of Satsuma and Aitsu, which operated under the command of Saiko Takamori and Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Outnumbered by over 10 to 1, the Choshu attackers were forced to retreat, and in the process, they burned down parts of Kyoto. But Choshu's defeat would not end there, as the next year, an international fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships would sail into the Shimonoseki Strait and annihilate Choshu's forces in just 2 days with a devastating naval bombardment. As punishment for Choshu's insubordination to the shogunate rule, the Bakufu would organize and launch a punitive expedition into Choshu in the very same month that the international fleet had come and crippled Choshu's military. The expedition, however, ended without fighting, as Saiko Takamori negotiated with the Choshu army to hand over the plotters instead of fighting. While the shogun was relieved that this did not result in a war, Saiko's true intention was to preserve the force of Choshu, for it would be of use later on, as Saiko Takamori actually supported the Sonojoi movement. Following the first Choshu expedition, Saiko Takamori began to formulate his plans on overthrowing the shogunate. But in order to have the military to do so, he needed an alliance between his home domain of Satsuma and Choshu. The problem was that these two domains have always been traditional enemies. But after a series of intense diplomatic discussions between the two domains, spearheaded by Sakamoto Ryoma from the Tosa domain, An alliance was formed between Choshu and Satsuma, creating the Sachio Alliance. Satsuma then began exporting British weapons to Choshu, along with the hiring of European officers to train their military. This militarization was brought to the attention of the Tokugawa Shogunate, who organized a second punitive expedition into Choshu the next year. This time a battle did happen, as the Shogunate army of 15,000 men clashed with Choshu's 4,000 men. The battle quickly turned towards Choshu's favor as their drilled and armed soldiers sent the antiquated shogunate men running, and ending the second Choshu expedition in a disaster for the shogunate. The Bakufu was dealt another blow as Tokugawa Iemochi passed away shortly after the expedition. He was replaced by Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who is based in Kyoto. Yoshinobu immediately negotiated a ceasefire with Choshu and began a rapid reformation of the Bakufu along with modernizing the outdated military with imported weapons. The training was given by British and Russian advisors, along with an additional 17 French officers that were sent to Japan as a part of a mission. Meanwhile, Satsuma and Choshu were brought to the attention of the unprecedented speed of the modernization of the shogunate military under the rule of Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Fearing that the Sonojoi movement would be compromised, the Tosa domain threw in their support for the Sachio Alliance. A letter written by Sakamoto Ryoma was first sent to Yoshinobu, urging him to resign from shogun. Yoshinobu at this point realized that the Tokugawa family can no longer hold on to power, and decided to step down while transferring political power to the emperor and moving to Osaka, but he would preside over the governing council of daimyos, keeping some of his political influence. At the same time, Emperor Komei passed away from smallpox in January of 1867. He was then succeeded by his 14-year-old son, Mutsuhito, who would later be known as the popular Emperor Meiji. Meanwhile, Saiko Takamori and Okubo Tochimichi found out about Yoshinobu's schemes as the governing consul. Yoshinobu had planned for the position to be led by a member of the Tokugawa family, and for them to exploit the position and the emperor's power. With this, they obtained an imperial edict that allowed them to use force against Yoshinobu and the Tokugawa government. Shortly after, an army of 5,000 men from the Sachio Alliance marched into Kyoto, where a meeting was held in the imperial court, which saw the abolishment of the shogun and Yoshinobu being stripped of all his lands and titles. A new ruling government was declared, which was to be led by the emperor, not the shogun, while Emperor Meiji handed out positions in the new government to the supporters of the Sonojoi movement. And lastly, the Meiji era was declared by the emperor on January 3rd of 1868, ending the Edo period. However, Yoshinobu would oppose the imperial court's decision, which led to him sending a message of protest to be delivered to the imperial court. A large army, consisting of 15,000 soldiers, was also dispatched to deliver the message, traveling from Osaka to Kyoto on the two roads of Toba and Fushimi. And on January 29th of 1868, the army of the shogunate faced off the army of the Sachio Alliance on the outskirts of Kyoto, starting the Boshin War.